Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 5 game from the Grenke Chess Open. Now, if you followed the round 4 video, you know that I won a third game in a row after my sluggish first round draw, and in fact, it actually played all Germans up to this point. So it actually been 4 Germans in a row, and I'd gotten 3.5 out of 4. And now in this round 5 game, I actually finally got the chance to play up, to play someone higher rated than me. My opponent turned out to be Grandmaster Borki Predojevic. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he's actually a Bosnian chess grandmaster and was actually the youngest ever from his country when he became a grandmaster in 2005 when he was 18. So very, very talented player. I believe at the time I was playing him, he was around 2600, low 2600s, and just a huge challenge for me. Now, I had the white piece in this game, so I was hoping to also make use of that and kind of put him under some pressure and get a good position and keep the momentum going. So let's see what happened. So I opened with d4. Borki went knight f6, and then I played c4, e6, and knight f3. Yeah, I wanted to kind of see what he was trying to do. I wasn't sure whether he was going to go for a queen's gambit or Benoni, or I really had no idea what type of line he was going to go for. I did see some e6 d5 stuff, but it's always tough to say when you're playing strong grandmasters because it's very rare that they just play one system. So I kind of just had to be ready for whatever. Borki did wind up going d5, which was good news because I had taken a few peeps at this, and I opted for knight c3. And Borki's next move actually surprised me because it was actually knight bd7. And knight bd7 is a kind of hybrid of these queen's gambit decline positions. It's like almost a combination of queen's gambit decline and semi-Slav type of ideas. But the really key thing with knight bd7 too is in some respects it's actually threatening the pawn on c4. So the point is that if I leave this pawn unprotected, black can play something like knight b6 and try to hang on to that pawn temporarily. The flip side of it is that, there's a cost to trying to do that. So actually the main line in this position is actually bishop f4. And now black has a wide range of choices, but let's say after a move like d takes e4, I can go e3, and black can play knight b6 to try and hold on to the pawn, but there's actually just bishop takes c4, knight takes e4, and queen a4 check. And, the point in this position is that white recovers the pawn and has more space, but black maintains the 2 bishops. And so black kind of has the long-term trump, while white has the short-term assets. I was familiar with this setup with bishop f4, and I actually didn't want to go for it on this day because I'd actually played this in my last event in Reykjavik, and I was thinking maybe Borki had taken a look at some of these positions and had some really important improvements. So given that, he was the first to surprise, I definitely wanted to not go down that path that he may or may not have intended. So I had to decide to play the more timid, more harmless looking c takes d5. And the point is I'm not giving up that pawn on c4. I'm trying to resolve the tension in the center right away and then see what happens. So after e takes d5, now I went bishop f4, but now the center is fixed, so he has none of those d takes c4 tricks. But this is in some ways a small victory for black from the standpoint that by taking on d5 and black recapturing, now this diagonal is open for the bishop to be deployed on, where typically as long as there's a black pawn on e6, this bishop winds up having to go to b7. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, again, I do have the advantage of maybe, not an advantage, but I'm happy that I do get this fixed center. But again, this diagonal for black, and in some respects now it's actually easier for black to also take control of the e4 square, which is critical in these Carlsbad structures where black has a pawn majority on the queen side and white has a pawn majority on the king side. A lot of times black makes use of this e4 square, and now that the e file is half open, he can put a rook on e8 or a queen on e7 and kind of eye that square, and bishop on f5. So those are all some dynamics to be aware of. So anyway, after bishop f4, black went c6. That's normal, defending the d5 pawn. And now I went queen c2. And I actually think this is actually another mistake, believe it or not. And the reason it's a mistake is normally you play queen c2 quickly in these queen's gambit exchange lines to stop bishop f5. But because the knight is already on d7, this knight is already on d7, you can't actually get bishop f5, in one go. So it was actually way more logical to just play e3 and then follow up with bishop d3. And yeah, maybe I'll go queen c2 later in the game to connect my rooks. But the point is I'm developing very quickly and I can cover the square with my bishop. Because, again, queen c2 kind of slows down, my kingside development. So anyways, after queen c2, black now went knight h5. And I think this move is actually entirely justified and quite strong. And the point is that he's actually trying to get rid of my bishop on f4 and actually trade it for his dark square bishop. And this is quite thematic in these Queen's Gambit exchange lines where, black tries to trade a few pairs of minor pieces to kind of alleviate any potential tension in the center, in particular, any type of aggressive intentions from white, and then steers the game towards extremely positional waters where maybe white does not have enough assets to actually attack, and then is frustrated by the character change of the position. So the bishop on this knight h5 challenging my bishop is very annoying because, I obviously don't want to go back to e3 and block my e2 pawn, and I don't really want to go back to d2 because then if I play e3, my bishop's, caught behind the pawn chain. So it's just a very nice move to challenge that bishop. Now I could go bishop d2, and then black could entertain a move like, let's say bishop d6 or something like this. And yeah, I could play e3 and bishop d3 and argue that maybe this knight on h5 is a little bit of a wayward knight, and I maybe could try to castle queenside and play g4. But I just didn't really buy that plan, so I actually opted after knight h5 to go bishop g5, just challenging the queen. Now black went bishop e7, and again, this is quite thematic, trading those bishops on G and E. Normally, actually, in some Queen's Gambit lines, the bishop actually is on G5, and the knight's on F6, and the bishop is on E7. And then black actually goes H6 to challenge the bishop, and then it winds up going back to H4, and then the knight H5 maneuver happens. So this is like a slightly different version of that same maneuver. Anyways, bishop G5, bishop E7, I take now, and now I play E3. And you kind of can see that why black could be happy here, because he managed to get rid of my very annoying dark squared bishop, and he is starting to gear up to having pretty good pressure on E4. Once this knight potentially returns to E4, it's just really good play there. And then this bishop on C8 again no longer has to develop on B7. It can actually develop on E6, F5, or G4 depending on the circumstance. So black is already, I think, nearly equalized. Another thing that was kind of worrisome / frustrating is I would love to have my bishop on D3. But in many cases now, knight F4 is actually extremely annoying because I'm pinned here, so I can't recapture with the pawn. And again, the bishop on D3 would be hit, and the pawn on G2 would be hit. So black has done quite well here. After E3, knight B6 was played, and that's very good. And it's actually the knight on B6 is actually quite effective in Carlsbad structures because in many lines it could go to C4 if white aims to go for this B4, B5 advance. He kind of has this knight's outpost, so very logical move. And at the same time, he clears the way for the bishop to develop. And again, you can see kind of what my problem is here is because I would love to play bishop D3, but it's not really possible because of knight F4, which is very, very annoying. So instead, I actually went for bishop E2, which is extremely modest, and really not the square you want to put the bishop on. So, yeah, it probably missed the mark. Another way to play the position was to probably go H3, and the point is you stop bishop G4 as an idea. You take away that square. And in some lines, you think about expanding yourself with G4. So if black goes G6, which is a normal maneuver in these lines to, sometimes reroute the knight to G7, or even just anchor the bishop on F5, I could actually go G4, force the knight to G7, and, okay, maybe this pawn is a little bit of a target after a potential H5, but for the time being, I've managed to rob the bishop of some of these active squares here, and maybe my queenside or my kingside expansion could be justified if I go queenside with my king. So just another way to play. Again, I went bishop d2, and it's just a little bit too timid. Black now went g6. It's a normal move. Also preparing this knight g7 move, and also sometimes bishop f5. And now I castled, and now black castled, and we're pretty much almost complete our development. My rooks are already connected. Black's one move away. But all of black's minor pieces are going to be on pretty good squares. And you already have to wonder here, what is white's pawn break going to look like? Because, I mean, e4 saddles me with an isolated pawn on d4, so I don't really want to do that. And I'd also forfeit the f4 square as long as the knight's on h5. b4 is actually kind of difficult to even get off here because the queen's already covering b4. Yeah, I mean, the prospects are just quite tricky here. One move I was thinking about is maybe rook b1, but after rook b1, even a5, and again, b4 is hard to come by here. If a3, trying to force in b4, maybe even a4 is a move. Just saying, no, you're not going to play b4. Because now I'd have en passant, and then my a-pawn would be quite weak with the rook and the queen bearing down on it. So I wasn't really sure where my pawn break was going to come from, and I was a little bit frustrated. And on the flip side, I thought that, all of black's pieces were doing quite well. Once this bishop pops out to g4, even to e6, he's quite solid. And this is actually a really good king's gambit position. Or, excuse me, king's gambit. No, queen's gambit exchange variation position. Another thing to keep in mind is there's sometimes these kind of slow-moving attacks, these slow-burning attacks on the king side for black with g6, where they can actually move the knight away and then go h5, h4, and take more space on the king side. I'd actually, a month or so before this tournament, I'd actually been reading quite a bit about AlphaZero and AlphaZero's games, and I saw this slow-burning attack in Matthew Sadler's book on AlphaZero. So I was a little bit wary to actually sort of sit and do nothing because I was aware that there were dangers in this position long-term. For instance, like let's say I just shuffle and do nothing. Something that is completely possible, believe it or not, is like rook e1, knight g7. I'm just shuffling h5, h4, h3, and then this type of position is extremely dangerous with a quote-unquote thorn pawn on h3 that's like helps with mating constructions. And on the flip side, if I play h3 myself to try to stop that push, I even saw lines where, again, I'm just making some sample moves, but I'd even seen games like this where black plays for g5 based upon the fact that white has created a hook on h3. Now, obviously, white gets moves too, and obviously is going to shuffle back and forth. But I think some of these, quote-unquote ghosts, if you will, or, things that I'd seen in other games made me think I need to act quickly or at least be extremely alert. And I think, maybe my fear or awareness of some of these plans made me a little bit too careful or at least a little bit too cautious. So, yeah. That was what I think maybe happened. So after castles, I went queen b3. And the idea with queen b3 was like, okay, b4 didn't seem super realistic. So I was thinking maybe I can play for a4 based on the fact that the knight is on b6. Because typically I wouldn't be able to go a4 because black would just go a5 and lock down my pawn breaks and control these dark squares. But because the knight is on b6, it's hanging, so he can't go a5. And after a4, a5, I thought I might incur some weakness in the black camp. So black now went for bishop g4, which is a good move, just developing this bishop. And I didn't fully appreciate why this was a good move until his next move, which was I played a4, continuing with my plan of playing a5. And now black went for knight c8. And knight c8 is super, super strong. And really, really instructive because whenever the knight gets to d6 in these Queen's Gambit exchange variations, black pretty much has a dream position. The reason is the knight on d6 controls the e4 square, the c4 square, and the b5 square. So by virtue of controlling b5, minority attacks are nearly impossible to get off. And by also controlling e4, he's also keeps an eye on playing towards the king side. And the knight also protects b7 on that square as well. So this knight on d6 is just an amazing, amazing piece, and just controls all the important squares in the position. And now that I play this a4, a5, like I'm not going to, if I actually wind up playing a5, he can go a6 and knight d6, and well, the issue is that, I would basically have no pawn breaks, because once my pawn's on a5, I could never get into b5. And again, e4 is not really a pawn break anymore either, so I'd have no counterplay. So I would just have to sit and wait. And this is a huge, huge turn of events, because, again, the knight coming to d6 is not something you should ever want to see. And so I realized here that I was in some trouble strategically long-term in this position. The other thing I was a little bit worried about is the consequences of bishop takes f3, believe it or not, because I didn't see any scope for my bishop if I didn't wind up playing e4. So, yeah, I was fairly concerned. Now, in this position, I think now that I saw knight c8, I really was like, okay, I need to try and play actively, and, maybe my aggression got the best of me, but... And I went for queen a3, which is a little bit of a strange, puzzling-looking move. The idea was actually to try and push through b4 and or take on e7. Instead, a more normal move and more logical move might have been h3. And the point is to actually, this exchange on f3 would actually be something I would be happy with, because after bishop takes f3, the knight has to move probably to f6. And now I can actually try to play for e4. I might not get it, but I could try. Like I could go rook fe1, knight d6. Okay, it kind of stops e4 for now, but maybe I have a move like queen a3 now, and maybe e4 is actually in the position because of this pin. And if he tries to stop it again, I might be able to play b4 perhaps and go for some minority attack, although that does give up the c4 square. Point being that this bishop would be a pretty decent piece, even though it's not activated yet. It would control some light squares, at least dominate the knight for now. Instead, even after h3, black could actually go bishop e6. And the point is now this bishop is on this diagonal, so e4 is again an impossibility. And I've actually created a hook on h3, which would be kind of devastating long term if the queens stay on the board. So just things to think about, I mean, it's really a tricky position already to handle, because, I haven't managed to get my minority attack off, and all of black's minor pieces are extremely well placed. So anyways, I went for queen a3, and my idea was extremely radical. The idea was that after queen takes a3, which was played, to actually go b takes a3. And this idea was flawed, but and ultimately not correct. But the point was to try and get pressure on the b file and just manufacture some pressure, because given that I didn't see I had any pawn breaks, I thought I could at least need activity for my pieces. Now, the better move would have been rook takes a3. But again, this is a position I was not, quite comfortable with, because I thought black goes a5, secures this weakness, the weakness on b4, and then let's say after knight e5, takes, knight d6. Again, you can see how this knight on d6 does an amazing job of controlling all these important squares, and, to add insult to injury, I still don't have a pawn break. And again, no pawn break, no plan. That's just the way it works. So it is what it is. Now, I could maybe have tried here like rook b1 and b4, but the point is when I do that, after he trades, the a pawn is weak. And again, this b pawn is not a problem as long as there's a knight on b7. So for instance, let's say I went rook b1, rook a7, b4, nope, not b3, b4, takes, and now rook fa8. And you can see this b7 pawn is way more secure than the pawn on a4. So that's kind of the problem I'm always dealing with. So anyways, instead of that, I went for b takes a3, and the character of the position changes a little bit because it seems that I have some counterplay on the b file, but it's not super realistic. Black started with the very strong move a5, and this is actually something that I think I didn't truly appreciate. I thought by playing a5, he's creating some weaknesses, specifically on b6, and I would be able to anchor rooks there or something like that. But the issue is after a5, it's very difficult to get a third piece in the attack on the b7 pawn. And he can actually very easily defend the b7 pawn once he goes knight d6, rook e8, rook e7, and worst case scenario, even rook a7, and he has at least 3 pieces to protect that pawn on b7. And in the flip side, now my doubled a pawns are fixed weaknesses for the endgame. Keep that in mind. So after a5, I went rook a b1. Black now went knight d6, covering that pawn. And again, I have pretty much no counterplay here. No pawn breaks to speak of, so pretty unfortunate. I now went knight e5, trying to maybe trade some pieces and maybe thinking about getting my knight to d3 and then to c5. And after captures, now black went knight f6. Good move. Again, now eyeing this square with this knight. I went rook fc1, just trying to keep an eye on the c5 square because I thought if this rook moves away, I'd be able to attack a5. But he's in no rush to move the rook away necessarily, and instead went rook a7, which I think is a really good bit of prophylaxis. The point is that you cover b7 a second time before I even get a second piece to attack that pawn, and you just kind of wait and see what white's trying to do because it's really hard for me to make moves without creating weaknesses. Note that if I move my knight from e5, all of a sudden knight c4 is a possibility hitting the weak a3 pawn, and just it's a monster outpost, so keep that in mind. So anyways, I went f3 trying to control this knight on coming to e4, but f3 is extremely double-edged because now I'm permanently weakening the e3 pawn, and it's extremely unrealistic that I'm going to get in e4. So now I've actually managed to weaken another pawn in my camp when I already have weaknesses on this side. And it was a tough decision to make because when you are in a position where when you are not in a position of strength, you kind of want to not create any more targets. But I just didn't think I could sit around forever. The plan that I was really concerned about is ultimately rook e8, maybe rook e7 or something like that, and then black playing f6 and kicking my knight away. And so once my knight gets kicked away, then he can continue to start expanding on the king side and just pretty much needling me into submission. So I thought that it was better to at least stay and try and think of something active. But unfortunately, my activity ultimately kind of does me in because it's kind of misguided, and it would have been better to stay passive. But again, as a human player, it's very, very difficult to do this. After f3, black went rook d8. Again, kind of a waiting move. Also, perhaps eyeing pointing out that if you ever try e4, that's d4 is going to be very weak. But I don't think that there was anything super direct with the move. And now he also gives me another opportunity to do something silly, which I wind up doing with g4. I thought g4 is a pretty active move. It's something that you normally do in some of these Queen's Gambit exchange structures when the queens come off the board. You essentially try to expand on the king side with your pawn majority and try to argue that the space that you get out of it is worth it. But the flip side is that I have too many weaknesses to even entertain this majority. Again, a3, e3 are sensitive. Black now goes knight d7. I think this is an excellent move because if the knights get traded, then this e3 pawn is more of a target. So I think he did well to kind of try to do that. I actually went knight takes d7. The reason for that is if I go knight d3, black actually has knight c4. And the thing that concerned me here is not only are both my pawns hanging, which is a huge problem, but also my knight on d3 is no longer can even jump to c5 because this knight is now on d7 covering that square. So I thought I just had to take. And after takes, step one is complete. Get rid of this knight on e5. That was my one active piece. And now train against the new weaknesses. And the other thing is now that my knight on a5 is gone, the c4 square is ripe for the picking. So I have to always worry about a knight coming to c4 and just attacking stuff. I went king f2 to at least cover one of my weaknesses. And now black went rook e7. And black now has a very, very simple plan to just train his pieces against this weakness. Especially considering, again, I have no targets to speak of. This pawn on b7 is well defended by this knight on d6. And you can just see the difference in knights here are extraordinary. I mean, this knight is clocking in overtime, and my knight hasn't even gotten to work yet. So, huge problem. After rook e7, I went rook c3, kind of anticipating some pressure on e3. Rook a8 back, logical. And now I went knight f4, trying to, in a dream scenario, get my knight to c5, but it's not happening. Black now went rook a8, and I can't even transfer the knight because e3 is hanging. So I went for h4, trying to expand a little bit more and to justify my space on the king side. But all I'm doing is actually just creating targets. That's all I'm doing. I'm pushing pawns and creating more targets for black to work with. And I think it's quite instructive to see how Borki takes advantage here. He starts with king g7. Good move. You basically, it's kind of like a waiting move, but it also clears the H file for the rook in some lines. And, he's still trying to decide how he's going to encroach with his pawns. I now went knight g2, just protecting protecting e3, because it was clear to me that I had no way to make progress here, so I thought I need to at least defend e3. And now black went h6, another excellent move, just slowly improving. And well, what's the threat? The threat is, in some positions, that black can go g5. And the point is, after g5, if I go h5, then there's f5, ripping open my structure. And if black manages to rip open these pawns in some way, he's going to have another opening, another file that opens that would, basically be decisive. So you can imagine here, for instance, if the f pawn is pulled away, this e4 square is devastating. So that's one thing. If the h pawn is pulled away, then the h file will be devastating. If the g pawn is pulled away, then the f5 square will be devastating. So you can pretty much see that whatever pawn, if any of these pawns get pulled away, fg or h in some fashion, either the knight or the rook gets an outpost. So very, very important, and just kind of the principle of two weaknesses. You create a weakness on one side of the board, and then you try to get one on the other side, and then it's just near impossible to defend both. So after h6, I went knight f4 back, kind of anticipating g5 or h5 move, trying to get at my pawns. And now he wins for g5 anyway, which I thought maybe I was stopping because I have knight h5 check. But he very alertly and adroitly recognizes that, with the king on g6, I mean, it's just one check. And so very, very good spot for him. So I took on g5, and after h takes g5, I actually did go knight h5. But after king g6, my position is nearly in ruin because, again, now black's threat is actually f5. And again, if he manages to get f5 and then f takes g4, then the e4 square is a monster outpost for the knight, and my pawn on e3 would be backward, and he'd be able to invade on the f or maybe even the h file. I played knight g3 just to cover the f5 break, but you can see now the h file is open. Black wound up going rook h8, which makes a lot of sense based on the weakness I've created there. I went king g2 to just stop rook h2 check. And now f5 was played. And it's just so difficult now. He's coming with everything to hold this together, because now even the king is getting in on the act. I took on f5. And then knight h4 check is also a threat here, and knight takes e3. So I also took on f5. And we have a position where the material is still equal. And we're in a rook endgame, but the pressure is still on. Black now has ideas of transferring both rooks to the h file and then invading like that. And it's just a massive amount of pressure. I went rook h1 to stop rook e h7, and black now took. And even here, with one rook on the board, there's still a tremendous amount of pressure after the very strong g4. And the point is that after g4, my pawn is going to eventually be eradicated, and there's going to be some type of weakness that will give the black king a highway to enter the position. One kind of funny line, of course, I mean, this didn't happen, but it's kind of funny or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, is after f4, I'm basically nearly completely lost because after king e4, the king can kind of just walk in. Like, let's say king g2, I don't know, maybe king e4 not right away. Let's say rook h3 first, king g2, and then well, maybe rook h3. This is something that's extremely, extremely dangerous because, again, all my pieces are kind of tied down. Let's say rook b3, king e4, rook takes b6, rook takes rook takes e3. And this position is probably just winning for black because both these pawns are hanging. These a pawns aren't going anywhere. My king is super passive. Just a really good example of just how king activity in the endgame really matters. So I can't play f4. And if I play f takes g4, after king takes g4, there's also some real problems. So anyway, after g4, I went king g2, trying to at least get my king up here to establish some opposition a little bit further up the board. But black now went for rook h7, and I think this is a really, really smart move, keeping the tension here, because as long as I can't push f4 because the rook invades, that's kind of, a huge problem. And then if I play f takes g4, it's black that winds up getting the opposition, and my king lacks space. So I think that's very alert on black's part. Now, the flip side, I don't think I can just stay passive because there's also ideas of rook h3 in the air. So I did wind up playing rook b3 just to kind of tie this rook down, hopefully to the b7 square. But now black played g takes f3 with check, king takes f3, and king e6. And this is kind of the critical position because even though the material is equal here and there are 4 pawns and they're all on the same side, my weaknesses make this a very, very tough hold. Now, the computers actually say that I'm not losing here, but the thing is I have no active plan to speak of, and black can kind of just needle me to death. That being said, I was quite pleased that I had managed to get a completely lost position by now because I'd been defending so pitifully for such a while, or at least it felt like I was just getting pushed back and encroached upon and not really getting anywhere. And this is the first moment where I was like, wait, do I actually have chances? Because now the king was actually moving back. And why was the king moving back? Well, it was moving back because the rook has to guard the b7 pawn for the time being, instead of getting any counterplay, because he can't move away and just allow me to take it. So the question is, how do I play from here? Like, how do I do anything? One of the main issues is that I can't just play e4, which I would love to play because trading my backward pawn because of rook h3 check and my rook goes. So I actually have to just stay passive here, but the question is how to do that. If the king comes to c7, then the rook all of a sudden can be active again. And yeah, it wasn't entirely clear to me what to do. I went for rook c3, and this is actually the beginning of a very flawed plan. I thought that it would be clever to play rook c3 to play rook c5 and make the a5 pawn a weakness, to make the b pawn weak by playing b6. So I thought it would be good to provoke b6 because then the whole construction would be a little bit weak. But it turns out putting my rook on c3 and then c5 puts it in a very, very precarious spot and a little bit out of play. Black now went king d6, and I did go rook c5, following through with my plan of pressuring the pawn. But after rook h3 check, my king was forced to move, and then after b6, my rook is just forced back. And I thought, you know what, maybe it was good to create this b6, have this pawn go up, because now I can target it on the b file. But the issue is that, by allowing him to play b6 with tempo, I'm actually inviting him to play c5. And playing c5 actually gives him a passed pawn on the c file, which I didn't quite fully realize it would be that significant, but it is a significant factor. And so I shouldn't be encouraging the c5, c4 stuff. Instead, my rook c3, rook c5 plan, it would have been much smarter in this position to just go rook b1 and to kind of sit on the position best I can and just kind of shuffle instead of provoking b6. Yeah, so after this stuff with rook c3 and rook c5, this did wind up happening. I went rook c1 back, and now c5, and you can see that this is the huge problem, that once c4 is on the board, all of a sudden there's certain pawn endgames that are just losing for me, because if the rooks are traded, the c pawn is a protected pass pawn. Meanwhile, my king would have to come back over and address that protected pass pawn, and then black's king can invade in the position. And to be honest, that's kind of what wind up happening. The flip side is that if I take on c5, I mean, okay, now he still has this pass pawn, but he also has the 4th rank for checks and to switch over to my weak pawns on the queen side. So really, I don't even want to take the pawn, but, you know, what else? So a tough spot to be in after c5. I went rook b1 trying to target the b6 pawn. I thought that was my saving grace, is that once he plays c5, b6 would be weak and backward. But after king c6, I don't really have any more forthcoming checks. I went rook c1 now trying to pin this one. The thing that I realized here is that I was thinking about playing rook g1, but it just dawned on me that, well, it doesn't work. For starters, black could play rook h6 and then continue with c4, and that probably does the trick, honestly, because now c4 is coming. But you can also even play c takes d4 like this, and after e takes d4, rook takes a3. It's hard to imagine this position would be holding with the 2 connected pass pawns. Although there would be some chance here, black would definitely be for choice. So anyways, after rook c1, black went rook h2, now coming around like this. And now I went for rook c3, which is very, again, defensive, trying to cover a3, but it's very, very passive here. And at any moment, c4 might be a move. And c4 connected with rook b2 and rook b3 would be a huge problem. After rook c3, black went rook f2 check. I think this is a great intermediate move, forcing my king to make an awkward decision. If I go to g3, my king is completely cut off on the f-file. But if I go to e5, my king is completely cut off here, and it's unclear whether my king should be stepping up the board anyway. So instead, I did go king g3, and now black went rook f1, and I'm kind of cut off. And again, I have to make a really tough decision. What to do? I mean, do I move my king? Do I move my rook? Do I take on c5? All the moves are fairly uncomfortable. I played king g2, challenging that rook, and now rook b1 was played, and you can see here the real problem, that now c4 and rook b3 is a huge threat, basically forcing me to lose material or trade to a losing king pawn endgame. I went king f2 to try and at least stave that off a little bit, but now c4 is played, and the issue is that rook b3 is a major threat, and it's not something I can really deal with, because I can't stop rook b3, but also stop the invasion of the king. So I went king e2, shuffling my king over to quickly to c2 to stop rook b3, because now if rook b3, I can go king d2, and then after we trade rooks, I might be able to hold that. But now, after rook b2 check, very smartly, he forces my king back to the 1st rank where it's completely cut off, and now just goes rook a2, puts his rook on the weakness of the a3 pawn, and is now going to slowly bring the king over. I went king c1, just waiting, but now king d6, and you can see the decisive maneuver is coming. And you can just see, just the difference in activity is the difference in the game. I mean, this rook is super passive, this rook is active. This king is super passive, this king is active. Even black's pawns are further advanced than mine, so all those things make a huge difference. I went king d1, just kind of waiting, king e6, and you can see here that king f5 is a move that's coming, so I thought, all right, let me at least, try my one shot in the position, which is e4, breaking up the pawns. But now after d takes e4, rook takes e4, and rook takes a3, the position is not really holdable because, again, my king is super passive. This king is super active coming in. And, king d5 will actually just win the d4 pawn. I went rook c6 check, at least trying to pick off b6. But after king d5, rook takes b6, king takes d4, and not only did I lose the d4 pawn, but the a4 pawn will be lost on the very next move. And having 2 pawns to nothing in this position would be a very, very easily winning position for black, and just a technical task that I wasn't going to make Borki play out. So in this position, I actually resigned. Tough game. I think I basically did not get any advantage with white out of the opening, and I kind of panicked in a position that was equal because I didn't see any pawn breaks for me, and it just was a very, very radical and poor decision to play b takes a3 after that queen trade. So I ruined my pawn structure, created more targets for my opponent, and then I also created targets on the king side when I played for f3 and g4, when it proved to just be too many weaknesses in too many places. So it's very difficult to defend without creating a weakness, but you got to try and do it because that can be all the difference. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.